Walt Disney Pictures presents
Star Command, come in. Do you read me?
the story of two toys
There seems to be no sign of intelligent life anywhere.
Hello?
headed for a showdown.
My name is Woody. This is my spot.
I am Buzz Lightyear. I come in peace.
You are a child's plaything!
You are a sad, strange little man.
Hello and welcome back to For My Consideration, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where I take a request from a patron to talk about any movie of their choosing that was nominated for at least one Oscar. And today we are talking about Toy Story, which was nominated for 3 Oscars. This was requested by my patron Dylan. Thank you, Dylan, for a very fascinating choice for many reasons. And with such a big, important film like Toy Story, I thought it would be better to just have not one but 2 guests to break this monumental movie down. First off, you've heard this guy on a number of bonus episodes of the show for On Second Thought, plus his very first episode here, as longtime listeners may recall, was talking about Apollo 13 from this very same year of 1995. So I guess he's my 1995 expert. I don't know. From Next Best Picture, welcome back, Daniel Howat.
Hello. Glad to be back. I guess this year I need to mark down that this is my year. This is my expertise year.
If you were to ever write a book about movie history, here you go.
All right. I'll thank you in the credits.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my other guest is a favorite of mine from film Twitter and other forms of Twitter as well, not just film Twitter. He has a blog called The Many Rantings of John, and a patron who requested to be on an episode, and I'm so excited to have him here for the first time. Welcome, John T.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here. Great to be here discussing. And thank you, Daniel, for letting me come on with your 1995 expertise here.
A lot to live up to, John.
I know. I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it.
The pressure is on. All right. Shall we just get right into a summary? We have a lot to talk about, so no time to waste. All right. Toy Story is the very first feature-length computer animated film, and it takes place in a world where toys have the ability to come to life, which they only do when humans aren't around to see them. So we meet this collection of toys owned by Andy, with a sheriff named Woody being his favorite. So he's essentially the leader of the toys, until one day when Andy gets a shiny new action figure toy, Buzz Lightyear, which overshadows Woody and causes Woody to basically have a breakdown and sabotage him as much as possible, which leads to them eventually being lost and trying to make their way back home. So the film was directed by John Lasseter, who also co-wrote the story with Pete Docter, Andrew Stanton, and John Ranft, with the screenplay by Joss Whedon, Andrew Stanton, Joel Cohen, not the one you're thinking of, and Alex Sokoloff. And it features the voice stylings of Tom Hanks, Tim Allen, Don Rickles, Jim Varney, Wallace Shawn, John Ratzenberger, Annie Potts, John Morris, Eric Van Denton, Arlie Ermey, and Laurie Metcalf. And Toy Story made $192 million at the domestic box office, making it the #1 film of the year, and it scored 3 Oscar nominations, plus a Special Achievement Oscar for John Lasseter. So let's talk about it. There's a lot to get to here, like I said. So wherever either of you want to start, feel free. Perhaps we can just sort of mention our relationship to this film, to this franchise even. Let's start with Daniel.
Yeah, I love Toy Story. Grew up with it, I'm sure, as most of us did. And I definitely have a personal connection to the series. I don't know how old you guys are, but as the franchise grew, to Toy Story 3, I left for college in the summer of 2010. So I was exactly Andy's, on the same journey as Andy. So that's talking about the franchise as a whole, of course. But because of things like that, yeah, it's really special to me, as I know it is for so many millions of people. So I just grew up. This movie has always been, in my life in some way. I don't remember the first time I saw it. I've just always watched it, ever since I was a kid. And, it's 30 years old almost. And it still works so well. I've got 2 kids at home and we love watching it together. And so it's wild, how well it's held up over all of these years. Just the storytelling is so strong. The thing is, I was thinking about this podcast, the biggest thing that's just stuck out to me is how lucky we got with this being the first computer animated film, and it's also incredible. Both. Like, it didn't have to be both. The first one could have been Ants, right? It could have been
Oh boy. Wow.
terrible and forgettable and whatever. But this is both the first one and one of the best ones. It's both things. And so, yeah, I was just kind of like thinking about how rare it seems like that it's history and quality at the same time. But yeah, love Toy Story and love the whole franchise.
Yeah. And I do think in that regard, it is somewhat similar to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, just kind of knocking it out of the park right away.
Exactly.
So there you go. All right. Well, John, what are your thoughts? What's your relationship with this film?
So I remember, I'm a little older than you two here, because I do remember watching it in theaters for the first time in a Bemidji, Minnesota multiplex. And I remember just sort of being awed by it because it looked so different than any other animated film I'd ever been to. And just, I kept thinking, like, how is it moving like that? And it was just sort of this wild visual effects situation. And I think, to Daniel's point, that it didn't have to be as good of a film. And I don't know that it would age as well if it hadn't been as good. Like Snow, it could have been like The Jazz Singer and been technically impressive, but awful. And it wasn't. And I think I just loved it. And I remembered thinking at the time, and I wanted to see more of this, and you had to wait 3 years at the time to be able to see the next really important computer animated film. But I love this movie, and I think it's one of the best Pixar films still.
Yeah. I can't disagree. I can't really break away from the chorus here, unfortunately. But I very much had a pretty, I guess, standard now obsession with Toy Story growing up. I was at the exact right age to see, especially the first 3, as you were alluding to, Daniel. I graduated from high school the year before Toy Story 3 came out, which somehow made it feel even more resonant, just like being at that crossroads moment. But yeah, I had all the toys. I feel like I had like every single one of them, honestly. And I just remember really loving the dynamics between these characters and the colorful qualities of this world. The fact that it felt so different from traditional Disney 2D films that I was used to. Even the music I really enjoyed. This was certainly my first taste of Randy Newman. I'll say that. So
Same.
and watching it again this past week, as cheesy as it is to say, it kind of just feels like revisiting childhood again, and I think that is a big part of the appeal for both kids and adults. Kids just love it because it's colorful and vibrant, and it has great characters, and it's a fun story, and it doesn't really feel like it's talking down to them, And then for adults, it really does remind you of that childhood innocence, and it is a surprisingly dark story at times. And just from looking at the origins of the film, Disney kind of wanted it to be different from their traditional 2D films. They wanted it to have more edge, and Pixar didn't want it to be like this musical or like coming from a classic fairy tale, obviously, because at the time Disney was just the only ones that could really do that best. So Pixar really wanted to establish their own brand and something that could be really enjoyable for all ages, and they made the intention of centering the story first. I think that's really why the film has endured as long as it has, is like, the story is dictating the technology and the animation and everything. And to make another comparison, as odd as it may sound, I sort of contrast it with like Avatar as well in that sense, which like the original Avatar is like so dictated by the technology over the story, I would argue. And I think that's part of maybe why it doesn't have that emotional resonance for audiences that much. And like we're all kind of saying, like, if Toy Story was just like a decently like well-crafted, visually stunning sort of display of technology, but it didn't have the emotional component, then it definitely would not have the kind of staying power it has.
Yeah, totally. It's almost like how much was luck and how much was skill, because it really does feel like they got lucky in so many ways, in that it's the things that you talked about, watching it now, decades removed, it just has this feeling, it just evokes childhood so much, because it's also about literal childhood toys. And so it just really works so well decades later, because it reminds those of us who grew up with it, it reminds us of childhood. If for some reason you didn't grow up with Toy Story, it still evokes this feeling of childhood, because that's what it's about. And so I think that's why it's had the staying power that it has. And yeah, crafting the story first is just it helped the technology support the story instead of the other way around. It's really incredibly well done.
It's also impressive that it was an original story at a time when animated films were not focusing on original stories. Disney was having massive success after success with fairy tales, and you have this original story that has had the staying power of Beauty and the Beast or a Little Mermaid, which have had hundreds of years to sort of build up that type of tale. And I think that's impressive, and kind of like, I know we'll get into the Oscars of it later, but like impressive about the writing about this particular movie.
Great point.
Yeah, totally. And I also think, maybe to build off of that, I think the decision to have this kind of old time kind of hero for Woody as a cowboy, and then juxtapose it with this astronaut action figure, not only is it a great just like odd couple pairing setup, but I kind of love how it reflects like this evolution of, American ideas of like what's cool, especially to boys, and how that can change over time. And I feel like it's like very indicative of how maybe adults watching this, or even those who made the film, could appreciate it, especially people who lived through the 50s and 60s, where there was such a mania around like space travel and astronauts and all that stuff, and how much it kind of opened people's minds. Not to go off on too much of a tangent, but the fact that you have like a cowboy and an astronaut, it feels like these kind of two pillars of like American toys that are marketed to young boys, and it feels very intentional. And yeah, I love how that's also kind of reflecting in their personalities. Obviously, the idea that Woody's been around the block for a while, like maybe he's a little cranky, but he understands his worth, and that there's like value in these kind of classic handmade toys like this, and then you contrast it with Buzz, and it's shiny and new and exciting, needs to learn the ways of the world, arrogant, also easily breakable compared to Woody. I think it just like fits really well together, and on multiple levels that may seem obvious when you sort of break it down like that. But I do think that is a fundamental dynamic and is very key to like the success of the film, and why it does continue to resonate, is that it's like very easy to understand this war of the old and the new, really,
Yeah, and to John's point, how rare that sort of relationship or friendship was at the center of kids movies at this time, or even now. I mean, it's still rare now. Two male leads as opposed to like a princess, and just the relationship between the two, developing a friendship, this contentious relationship first, which I think is so interesting. I think the relationships with the toys throughout, the relationships the toys have with each other throughout the whole film is really interesting, because they all are very gruff with each other, very stern, very making fun of each other. It definitely feels like risky moves, especially in the 90s, because it would have been very easy for these toys to come off as aggressive, abrasive, annoying, too mean. But it somehow works really well when you kind of take it as a whole. It works well for adults who get the jokes that they're saying about each other, and for kids, it's just a little bit more real. People kind of making jokes about each other.
You have to wonder if at the studio, when they were pitching the voice actors, they were like, "It's a kids movie with Don Rickles."
Right.
And wonder
Wallace
what the
Shawn. Yes.
Wallace Shawn. Nothing says kids movie like Wallace Shawn.
Mm-hmm.
It's also wild to think about Tom Hanks and Tim Allen, like, things I didn't understand as a kid.
Right.
The mega stars that these two guys are in 1995. I mean, I'm not sure that there are bigger stars in 1995 than the two of them. I mean, so really wild. And Tom Hanks, fresh off his second Oscar win. It's insane.
And Alan was
Home
in the
Improvement,
number 3 movie,
right?
number 3 TV series in America.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, good on them for bagging that talent right out the gate. Yeah, I did also want to note some of that kind of adult humor that someone in 1995 might not be used to from an animated film, like when Bo Peep is kind of like flirting with Woody and he's a little too into it, and there's like a Picasso reference, and like Mr. Potato Head is like removing his lips and like putting it on his butt to reference like Slinky being like an ass kisser basically for Woody. And then you have like Woody like holding this like corporate business meeting in the beginning, basically like, the plastic corrosion meeting on Tuesday was a big success. And just like, you can definitely see how, people of all ages, even if kids don't really understand what's happening here, there's just like a confidence in the tone that, like, even if you don't really get it as a kid, you're like, I could see how that's funny.
It strikes a good balance in that end of having the jokes be witty in their language or construction or whatever, right, to where like watching this with my kids is really interesting because the language and stuff is going totally over their head. Like they're not understanding the wit of these jokes, but the animation, has the like facial expressions on the characters or the cadence of a joke. And so the kids are like, "Oh, that's hilarious. That's so funny." I'm like, you didn't understand what they just said. So I think it's really well balanced.
Yeah, and you hadn't really had that. I mean, that's felt like the rigor du jour after like Shrek, where pretty much every animated film was made for the parents. But other than maybe Robin Williams doing Jack Nicholson impressions in Aladdin, you hadn't really had that sort of wink and nod to the fact that half of your audience is adults.
Mm-hmm.
And they're there for that 81 minutes too. And so how can you find a way to play with both, make sure both sides are entertained there?
I also, just speaking more to the screenplay, it's like, I love how confident they are in terms of really just establishing the stakes of how like they can never be caught making movements in front of humans. And for me, it's just like very impressive just watching this as an adult and having more of a, behind the scenes filmmaking brain for this, and like seeing the construction of it and how easily they just establish like these are the rules of this world and we just understand them immediately. And like toys, they cannot be seen being, animated in front of humans, and that's just how it is. And it's like a grave situation if it does happen. What's funny though is that it's not actually like explicitly explained like what would happen if that did end up happening. Obviously we have in the end what happens with Sid is like, okay, now we see why they would never do that to a human being, because it would psychologically damage them. But you kind of like have this innate understanding that like, okay, these are the ground rules. And yeah, it's just the screenplay for me is just like razor sharp, like no accidents. And yeah, knowing that it's their first feature-length film, it's like they're not going to leave any mistakes or anything in it. They're just going to be like, here's everything. We might never be able to make a film again, and like here it all is. And it's remarkable to me that it is like so tight as a screenplay,
and with so many screenwriters. I mean, that's a ton of people you mentioned, so it was clearly punched up a number of times. But yeah, it really works really well. And we haven't talked much about the music yet either, which is incredible. My first introduction to Randy Newman. I think most people like our age think that he's just a Pixar guy for the most part. And I mean, You've Got a Friend in Me. Come on. But way back in the day on our 1995 episode, we debated a little bit on whether, I know we're going to get to the Oscars here in a minute.
I was wondering if you were going to bring this up.
Of course I'm going to bring this up. But
all these years later,
Colors of the Wind winning over You've Got a Friend in Me. We can talk about that more in a minute, but
yeah,
You Got
we'll
a Friend in Me.
relitigate that.
Yes, we absolutely will. The music is just so good.
I'll be here for the tiebreaker.
Oh wow. Okay.
But also a scene that has stuck with me for decades is when Buzz is trying to escape, and the song, I think it's I Will Go Sailing No More. Beautiful moment. Like the music, it perfectly, accentuates that scene, and it's like exciting and thrilling but tragic at the same time. It's a gorgeous song. Obviously the focus is on You Got a Friend in Me, but the music throughout the whole thing, the score and the songs, are really perfect.
I agree. I think this is Newman's best film work in any capacity. This specific Toy Story, I think he obviously has some winners in some of the later ones, but in general, I think there's about 3 songs in the song, because there's the Strange Things Are Happening to Me.
Things,
yeah, Strange Things, and you've got it works so well and matches up so well, and it's one of those scores that when you're listening to it, you're like, oh, I'm gonna recognize this immediately after. Like, this is something I'm going to walk around Disneyland and I will instantly hear, oh, this is Toy Story, with or without the words. And I think that's kind of a testament, because I don't know that all of Newman's song scores are always that composed and interlocking, in my opinion. But I think this one just hits out of the park, and like, again, one of those things where they weren't taking any risks going into this movie. Everything had to be exactly buttoned up.
Yeah. And what's funny though is that that kind of does feel like, in a way, a risk to just kind of like go all in on Randy Newman and hope that it creates the right effect for audiences, because he has such a unique voice, and you don't know if it's going to be dissonant maybe with the rest of the story they're telling, but it feels like as like, imbued with what this movie is than anything else, really. And then just with like moving forward through the story, I feel like you really get this sense of danger through so much of the story, and in a way that is still so palpable to me. Even after seeing this countless times, you feel the stakes when like Woody and Buzz are fighting and knock each other out of the car, and it's like this primal fear that Woody is expressing of like really feeling kind of helpless and literally being lost toys at that point. Yeah, and all the way through the stuff with Sid and his room, which is like going to some dark kind of horror-ish moments. All the like mutated toys. I love, just because like as a kid, I think you're fascinated by those sort of scary things. Maybe I just was personally, but like the weird creatures and everything, I think it's just very kind of smart and truthful to not just make this kind of like like a goofy sort of diverting entertainment for kids. Like, these are just a bunch of toys. Like, there's this really great undercurrent of darkness and kind of curiosity about what's out there in the world that is explored here.
I remember being scared of the of the toys underneath the dresser. The one with the doll's head with the spiky hair, that's creepy, man.
Still to this day. Yeah.
But I love how much this film just captures imagination. Like, who has seen Toy Story and not just thought about that with their with their toys? Like, if their toys are coming to life, it's such an easy concept for everybody to just latch onto in their everyday life. And like you said, the fear of being left behind is so primal in us that it just pairs really well. It captures the imagination on the high level, and also some of those primal fears. I think that's why it works so well.
And I think that's why it works well as a series too. Every film that succeeds it, with the possible exception of Lightyear, has this sort of like innate part of growing up, an innate part of finding yourself and finding a different chapter of your life that isn't always easy. Whether it's the second one where they're talking about whether you should move on to new friends, or the third film where you're graduating, or the fourth one where you choose what's comfortable versus an adventure. And I think that's sort of beautiful in the way that watching this film, because I had not seen this film since at least 2019, and I had not seen it since to be able to reflect on watching Toy Story 4 afterwards. But I was struck by how much there's that resonant sort of straight line between Woody's specifically storyline in all of these, and his growth as a character from the beginning all the way to the end of the the fourth film, and how that is really easy for an adult looking back on this and remembering the watching this as a child and thinking, oh, okay, I remember these sorts of steps of my life and whatever they may have transpired as. I find that fascinating, how really emotional a lot of this movie is.
Thank you for listening to this preview of For My Consideration, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.